Imagine stepping onto the streets of 1940s Los Angeles, where the neon lights of jazz clubs flicker against the night sky and the hum of streetcars fills the air. In this vibrant yet divided city, a bold, eye-catching fashion trend began to emerge, one that would spark controversy, ignite conflict, and leave an indelible mark on history. This was the era of the zoot suit, a striking ensemble of oversized jackets, wide-brimmed hats, and baggy trousers that commanded attention wherever it went. But the zoot suit was far more than a mere fashion statement. It was a symbol of identity, pride, and defiance for Mexican-American youth, known as the pachucos. For these young men, wearing a zoot suit was a declaration, a way to assert their cultural roots and stand tall in a society that often treated them as outsiders. In a world where discrimination, economic inequality, and social prejudice were part of daily life, the zoot suit became a badge of honor, a statement that said, "We are here, we belong, and we will not be ignored." Each ripple of fabric, each tilted hat, carried a message of resilience and courage, reflecting the spirit of a generation determined to carve out its own space in a city that often refused to recognize their humanity. Yet, while the pachucos embraced the zoot suit as an emblem of identity, it was misunderstood and maligned by mainstream society. For many white citizens, especially those in positions of power, these flamboyant outfits were perceived as a threat or rejection of conformity. Wartime rationing and traditional values. The media seized on this perception, painting young Mexican Americans as troublemakers and gangsters simply for expressing themselves through clothing. Fear and prejudice intertwined, creating a perfect storm of tension in a city already simmering with racial and economic divides. In this video, we will journey deep into the heart of Los Angeles during this turbulent era. We will explore how the zoot suit, a piece of fabric and style, became the flashpoint for one of the most brutal racial conflicts in American history. We will uncover the stories behind the headlines, revealing not only the clashes in the streets, but also the resilience, pride, and cultural resistance of a community that refused to be erased. From the neon-lit dance halls to the bustling neighborhoods of Eastla, every thread of the zoot suit tells a story of defiance, creativity, and the fight for recognition. If you are ready to uncover the untold history of the Zoot Suit Riots, witness the bravery of a generation, and understand the lasting impact of this bold cultural movement, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. By joining us, you will explore history through a lens that celebrates courage, challenges injustice, and keeps the stories of those who fought for their identity alive. Don't miss a single moment of this journey into the vibrant yet turbulent streets of 1940s Los Angeles, where every jacket, every hat, and every step carries the weight of a generation refusing to be silenced. By the early 1940s, Los Angeles was a city of striking contrasts, a place where glimmering skyscrapers and neon-lit theaters hinted at prosperity and modernity, while countless neighborhoods remained shackled by inequality and systemic injustice. Beneath the surface of this bustling metropolis, the lives of Mexican American and Black communities were shaped not by opportunity, but by a web of segregation, discrimination, and constant vigilance against forces that sought to limit their freedoms. Streets teeming with commerce and culture could quickly become corridors of fear and tension, where a wrong glance or the wrong attire might attract unwanted attention from police officers or hostile citizens alike, and where everyday routines were underpinned by the invisible weight of societal bias. For Mexican-American families, many of whom had roots in California stretching back generations, the city's promises often rang hollow. Their neighborhoods, like Boyle Heights and parts of Eastla, were vibrant with life, music, and culture, yet they were also systematically neglected, plagued by overcrowded housing, underfunded schools, and inadequate infrastructure, landlords imposed exorbitant rents while providing minimal services, and restrictive housing covenants ensured that attempts to move into more affluent neighborhoods were met with threats, intimidation, and violence. At the same time, young Mexican Americans striving to assert their identity and pride often through cultural expressions like the Zoot Suit found themselves mischaracterized as delinquents and troublemakers. Their very presence in public spaces treated as a provocation rather than an assertion of dignity. Parallel to the Mexican-American experience, Black communities in Los Angeles faced similar, yet distinct, challenges. Concentrated in areas such as Watts and South Central, Black residents were systematically barred from accessing wealthier neighborhoods through policies rooted in both formal and informal segregation, leaving them to contend with overcrowded housing, limited job opportunities, and discriminatory practices that extended from employment to law enforcement, even as World War II opened certain industrial doors. These opportunities were often shadowed by resentment from white workers, who perceived minority laborers as threats to their social and economic dominance. Black Angelenos, much like their Mexican-American neighbors, were forced to navigate a city that profited from their labor while denying them the full rights and protections afforded to others, creating a pervasive sense of alienation and tension that permeated schools, workplaces, and public spaces alike. The police, meant to serve and protect, became a source of fear rather than security, particularly in minority neighborhoods. Officers patrolled with a presumption of guilt, their actions guided less by justice than by prejudice. Their presence a constant reminder that the law was not equally applied. Mexican-American youth, in particular, were subjected to profiling, harassment, and arbitrary arrests, often for minor infractions or merely for looking out of place in a society that deemed them outsiders. Black communities, too, were subjected to similar patterns of policing, where efforts to protect themselves or assert their rights were often met with suspicion, hostility, or outright violence. This climate of intimidation reinforced societal hierarchies, where compliance was enforced not only through legal mechanisms but also through fear, and where cultural expressions and community pride were continually at risk of suppression. Economic disparity further intensified these divisions, as the labor demands of wartime Los Angeles brought new opportunities while simultaneously stoking resentment. Factories, shipyards, and military installations opened positions previously denied to Mexican-American and Black workers, providing a glimpse of financial independence and social mobility. Yet these gains came at a cost. Tensions with white coworkers and supervisors often escalated into overt hostility, fueled by the perception that minority laborers were encroaching on spaces that had long been reserved for others. Neighborhood rivalries. Workplace discrimination, and the ever-present threat of police action combined to create an environment where prosperity was conditional, and where the assertion of identity or ambition could trigger confrontation and violence. Cultural expressions, particularly those of the youth, became focal points in this charged environment. The Zoot Suit, with its extravagant cut and bold style, was more than clothing, it was a declaration of presence and pride, a visual assertion that Mexican-American youth would not be invisible in a society determined to marginalize them. Yet this assertion of identity was met with alarm from white authorities and civilians, who interpreted flamboyant fashion as rebellion, defiance, and even criminality. Newspapers and radio amplified these fears, linking Zoot Suits with lawlessness and framing young Mexican Americans as a threat to public order. This media-driven narrative reinforced societal prejudices, lending legitimacy to discriminatory practices and emboldening those who sought to suppress minority communities. while simultaneously obscuring the deeper causes of inequality and marginalization. The intersection of racial segregation, economic disparity, and police harassment created a combustible environment in which cultural expression could become a flashpoint for conflict. Daily life for Mexican American and Black residents was a careful negotiation, a balancing act between maintaining personal dignity and navigating a society structured to limit their freedoms. Community spaces, social gatherings, and public streets were not neutral zones but arenas where identity, power, and resistance were constantly tested. Every public interaction was laden with meaning, where simple acts wearing a suit, walking down a sidewalk, speaking out could invite scrutiny or provoke aggression, reflecting the broader struggle of minority communities to assert their humanity within a system predisposed to deny it. Yet amid these challenges, resilience flourished. Communities built networks of support, nurtured cultural traditions, and found creative outlets for expression. Whether through music, dance, art, or fashion, the very streets that could host harassment and intimidation also became sites of solidarity, where identity was claimed and defended. In this context, the zoot suit was more than a garment, it was a statement of survival, a tool of resistance, and a marker of pride for a generation determined to assert its place in Los Angeles despite systemic barriers. It encapsulated the tension between oppression and self-expression, revealing both the depth of societal divisions and the unyielding spirit of those who lived within them. The story of Los Angeles in the 1940s is not merely one of conflict and marginalization. It is a testament to the resilience of communities navigating systemic inequities, to the power of cultural expression as resistance, and to the ways in which identity can flourish even in the face of entrenched societal obstacles. Understanding this layered reality illuminates the roots of the Zoot Suit Riots, providing context for the clashes that would soon erupt and offering a lens through which to appreciate the enduring legacy of courage, pride, and perseverance that continues to inspire generations today. As the world was engulfed in the chaos of World War II, Los Angeles transformed into a hub of wartime production. Its factories, shipyards, and military installations humming with unprecedented activity, drawing thousands into the rhythm of industrial labor. The city's booming economy, driven by the urgent demands of the war, created a unique and complex social landscape in which long-standing racial divisions were both challenged and exacerbated. For Mexican American and Black communities, this period represented an opportunity that had long been denied. Steady, well-paying work in industries critical to the war effort, aircraft assembly lines, welding shops, munitions factories, and shipyards became new arenas where minority laborers could demonstrate skill, resilience, and ambition, earning wages that offered a glimpse of independence and stability. Yet, these opportunities came with a shadow of resentment from white workers who perceived the entrance of minorities into the workforce as a threat to their social and economic dominance. The arrival of Mexican American and Black workers into these previously restricted roles disrupted established hierarchies and provoked tensions that extended far beyond the factory floor. White workers, many of whom were being drafted into the armed forces, left behind positions that were suddenly filled by those who had historically been excluded, generating both fear and hostility. Some employers, wary of potential conflict, attempted to implement segregation within the workplace, assigning minority workers to specific roles or separate sections of the factory. Yet these measures often only highlighted the underlying inequalities and intensified feelings of exclusion. For the minority laborers, the experience was double-edged. While they could finally access jobs that promised financial security, they also faced constant scrutiny, discrimination, and at times outright harassment from colleagues who viewed their presence as an affront to a social order that had long privileged whiteness. Beyond the confines of the factories, the effects of these tensions spilled into the streets, neighborhoods, and public spaces of Los Angeles, shaping the daily lives of Mexican American and Black residents. Economic mobility, though limited and often precarious, empowered these communities to assert their identities more visibly, cultivating a sense of pride and solidarity. Yet, this newfound visibility drew the attention of those who sought to maintain social hierarchies through intimidation and control, including law enforcement and segments of the white civilian population. The city, already a patchwork of segregated neighborhoods and racially biased institutions, became a pressure cooker in which economic advancement by minorities was perceived not as a shared contribution to the war effort, but as a challenge to white supremacy and entitlement. The tension between economic opportunity and social resentment found a potent symbol in the cultural expression of Mexican American youth, particularly the pachucos who donned the zoot suit. These oversized, flamboyant suits, with their long jackets, wide-legged trousers, bold hats, became a visual statement of identity, pride, and defiance. Yet in the eyes of white society, these outfits were interpreted as provocative and wasteful, violating wartime rationing regulations and challenging established norms of behavior and appearance. Newspapers and radio broadcasts amplified these perceptions, linking the zoot suit to delinquency, gang activity, and moral decay, portraying young Mexican Americans as threats to public order rather than as workers contributing to the nation's wartime production. The narrative fed into a broader climate of suspicion and hostility, turning what was essentially a form of self-expression into a justification for social policing, harassment, and ultimately violence. Meanwhile, Black workers faced similar scrutiny, particularly in areas such as shipyards and defense factories, where their presence disrupted long-standing racial hierarchies. Resentment from white colleagues sometimes escalated into verbal and physical confrontations. And employers, though dependent on minority labor for production goals, often tolerated or ignored discriminatory practices rather than confronting them. The broader social context of segregation and systemic inequities amplified these workplace tensions, reinforcing the notion that minority progress, economic or cultural, was inherently threatening to the established order. For Mexican American and Black communities, daily life became a constant negotiation, seizing opportunities for advancement while carefully navigating a society ready to punish any perceived overstep or assertion of agency. The convergence of economic opportunity, social resentment, and cultural assertion created a volatile environment in which minor conflicts could escalate into major incidents. The zoot suit, for instance, while initially a fashion statement, became a flashpoint precisely because it represented both cultural pride and economic presence. Young pachucos, empowered by their growing visibility and access to jobs, walked through city streets with confidence. Yet this very confidence drew the ire of those who sought to maintain social dominance. Encounters with white sailors, police officers, and civilians, often fueled by alcohol, rumors, or simple prejudice, could quickly erupt into confrontations that were magnified by the existing tensions within neighborhoods and workplaces. The riotous events that later unfolded were not spontaneous outbursts but the result of years of compounded grievances. The frustration of white workers threatened by economic displacement, the eagerness of authorities to assert control over minority populations, and the refusal of Mexican American youth to hide their identity or succumb to systemic oppression. This era demonstrated how economic mobility, while empowering, can simultaneously provoke resistance when societal structures are rigidly hierarchical and culturally biased. The success of minority laborers in wartime industries challenged assumptions about race, capability, and entitlement, exposing the fragility of social norms predicated on exclusion. Los Angeles became a microcosm of broader national dynamics, illustrating how opportunity without equity can inflame tensions, and how progress in one sphere, economic inclusion, cannot erase the barriers imposed by prejudice, segregation, and institutionalized discrimination. Ultimately, the intersection of wartime economic opportunities and entrenched racial hierarchies laid the groundwork for the conflicts that would soon erupt into the Zoot Suit Riots. The pachucos' defiance, expressed through style and presence, collided with a city unprepared to reconcile ambition, identity, and social equity. The tensions that arose from these dynamics were a stark reminder that while war can create openings for marginalized communities, the underlying prejudices of society do not vanish, they evolve, manifesting in ways that can both challenge and endanger those seeking to claim their rightful place. In the midst of factories, neighborhoods, and streets, the story of Los Angeles during World War II is one of ambition and opportunity shadowed by hostility and injustice, setting the stage for one of the most vivid demonstrations of cultural pride, conflict, and resilience in American history. As the tension in Los Angeles simmered throughout the early 1940s, the city's media and public officials played a decisive role in shaping perceptions of the emerging Zoot Suit culture, often casting the young Mexican-American pachucos as criminals, troublemakers, and unpatriotic citizens whose flamboyant attire was a visible affront to wartime sensibilities. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and government statements reinforced a narrative that portrayed these youths not as individuals asserting cultural identity or simply navigating a complex social landscape, but as a collective threat to public order, morality, and national loyalty. Headlines sensationalized minor incidents, exaggerating scuffles into purported gang wars and framing routine interactions with law enforcement as violent confrontations orchestrated by the Zoot Suiters themselves. Journalists employed language that dehumanized the youth, labeling them with words evocative animals or predators, presenting them as wild and uncontrollable rather than as young people caught in a web of social and economic inequities. Each story, each broadcast, built upon the last, creating a cumulative effect in which fear and suspicion of the pachucos spread through the broader Los Angeles population, making them targets of both societal disdain and institutional oppression. Authorities, whether motivated by personal prejudice, political pressure, or the desire to maintain order in a city already strained by wartime anxiety, largely aligned with this narrative. Police officers, instead of serving as neutral enforcers of law, frequently became agents of the prevailing social bias, turning their attention away from the aggression of white servicemen and civilians toward the victims themselves. Reports of assaults on Zoot Suiters were often dismissed, downplayed, or distorted to suggest provocation or culpability on the part of the minority youth, while crimes committed against them received minimal investigation and few consequences for the perpetrators. This systemic failure to protect marginalized populations reinforced a broader perception that the Zoot Suiters were both expendable and guilty, legitimizing further harassment and enabling patterns of violence to escalate unchecked. In this climate, fear and prejudice intertwined with official policy and media coverage, creating a social environment where the boundaries between truth and fabrication became dangerously blurred. The impact of these narratives extended far beyond the immediate incidents reported in the press. Young Mexican Americans, who had begun to carve out spaces of cultural expression through fashion, music, and social gatherings, suddenly found their everyday presence criminalized, their movements scrutinized, and their communities subjected to heightened surveillance and intrusion. Police raids on neighborhoods, once justified under the guise of public safety, became routine, with officers patrolling minority districts not merely to prevent crime but to enforce social hierarchies and suppress cultural identity. Ordinary acts walking through a downtown street, attending a dance hall, or simply wearing the zoot suit itself could trigger confrontation, arrest, or public humiliation, demonstrating how media and official narratives could materialize into tangible threats. Residents learned that legality offered limited protection when the law itself was interpreted through a lens of racial bias, and that being visible and proud in one's community could invite both physical danger and institutional censure. Compounding this dynamic, the city's leaders and military authorities often remained silent or indifferent in the face of growing violence, leaving the impression that the systemic targeting of zoot suiters was not only tolerated but tacitly approved. The combination of media vilification, political inaction, and law enforcement complicity created a volatile feedback loop. Reports of disorder fueled public animosity, which justified police harassment, which in turn reinforced negative portrayals in newspapers and radio broadcasts. This cycle left minority youth in an almost impossible position, defending their right to exist openly and express their culture while navigating a city that systematically framed them as the cause of the very dangers they were enduring. It was a vivid demonstration of how public perception, shaped by those in positions of power, can dictate the lived realities of entire communities, and how prejudice can be institutionalized to the point where victims of violence are simultaneously made culpable for it. Within the neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, and other minority districts, the effects of this media and official narrative were acutely felt. Community members, both young and old, faced the dual pressures of external threat from vigilante attacks and internal policing from authorities who treated them as suspects rather than citizens. Parents worried about their children walking to school or attending social events, while young men, particularly pachucos, balanced pride in their cultural identity with the need to navigate a hostile environment that could escalate into violence at any moment. The presence of white servicemen in the city, often intoxicated and emboldened by a media narrative that painted them as righteous enforcers, added to the sense of danger, transforming public spaces into arenas of potential conflict. Meanwhile, the legal system, rather than serving as a buffer against these dangers, often reinforced the message that conformity to dominant societal expectations, whether in appearance, behavior, or cultural expression, was the only path to safety or recognition. The broader societal consequences of this biased framing were profound, influencing perceptions of Mexican American communities for decades to come. By portraying zoot suiters as inherently criminal, unpatriotic, and threatening, the media and officials contributed to a cultural memory in which minority youth were associated with rebellion, delinquency, and moral deviance. Regardless of their actual conduct, this narrative justified not only immediate acts of violence during events like the Zoot Suit Riots but also long-term patterns of discrimination in employment, housing, and law enforcement. For the young people caught at the center of these portrayals, the struggle was as much about reclaiming identity and dignity as it was about physical survival, challenging a city and a society that had codified prejudice into both perception and practice. Even as the riots unfolded, these narratives influenced how history was recorded, with mainstream accounts often emphasizing the alleged provocations of the pachucos while minimizing or ignoring the role of white mobs, law enforcement complicity, and systemic bias. Yet beneath the surface of these distorted depictions, the resilience, pride, and defiance of Mexican American youth endured. They continued to wear their zoot suits, assert their presence, and demand recognition in a society determined to erase them. embodying a resistance that transcended the immediate violence and left a lasting mark on the cultural and social landscape of Los Angeles. The media's framing and the officials' complicity, while powerful in shaping public opinion, ultimately could not extinguish the identity, dignity, and determination of a community whose history, struggle, and legacy continue to resonate today. Through this convergence of biased reporting, institutional indifference, and targeted aggression, Los Angeles in the 1940s offers a striking example of how power, perception, and prejudice intersect to shape lived experience, reminding us that narratives constructed by those in authority can both reflect and enforce social hierarchies, and that the fight for recognition and justice often begins in the contested spaces of everyday life, where identity, culture, and visibility collide with systemic inequities in ways that can define generations. The murder of Josie Galadodez, later sensationalized as the Sleepy Lagoon case, became a flashpoint in an already tense Los Angeles, transforming a personal tragedy into a citywide spectacle of fear, prejudice, and systemic injustice. On the night of August 1, 1942, a young man was found dead near the popular swimming hole known as Sleepy Lagoon, a place frequented by Mexican-American youth seeking respite from the heat and the pressures of daily life in segregated neighborhoods. The circumstances surrounding his death were murky, yet the media and law enforcement quickly cast suspicion on the local pachucos, portraying them not merely as potential suspects, but as emblematic of a larger threat posed by Mexican-American youth to the moral and social order of the city. Newspapers, radio commentators, and civic leaders amplified these allegations with little regard for verified evidence, portraying the accused as gangsters who lived by violence, intimidation, and defiance, and framing the incident as the inevitable result of a dangerous subculture that needed to be eradicated. Within days, arrests were made, and young men from various neighborhoods, many of whom had no direct connection to the crime, were rounded up and thrust into a judicial process that was fundamentally biased from the outset. The trial, which came to be known as the Sleepy Lagoon case, was steeped in racial prejudice, with prosecutors and judges implicitly and explicitly framing Mexican-American identity as inherently suspicious, criminal, and morally corrupt. Witnesses were coached or pressured into testimony that emphasized cultural stereotypes, while defense efforts were systematically undermined. The courtroom itself became a stage for racialized narratives, where the accused were treated not as individuals deserving of fair trial, but as representatives of an entire community that officials and the media had already condemned in the court of public opinion. Legal arguments, evidence, and procedural fairness were often secondary to the broader goal of demonstrating that Mexican-American youth were dangerous and untrustworthy, an approach that resonated with a public already primed by months of sensationalized media coverage. The impact of the Sleepy Lagoon trial extended far beyond the courtroom. The news of arrests, hearings, and eventual convictions was reported in ways that inflamed existing fears and prejudices, reinforcing the stereotype that Mexican-American youth were inherently violent and disloyal citizens during a time of national crisis. The fact that many of the defendants were ultimately wrongfully convicted despite scant evidence, and the dubious credibility of some prosecution witnesses underscored how deeply the city's legal system was entangled with social bias. The court's decisions, widely publicized, sent a chilling message to the broader Mexican-American community. Visibility, self-expression, and cultural pride could invite both legal and extralegal punishment, and the institutions designed to protect citizens could instead be used to enforce their marginalization. Families watched helplessly as their children were demonized, the boundaries between justice and persecution blurred, and neighborhoods that had long been vibrant centers of culture and identity found themselves under a cloud of suspicion and fear. This atmosphere of anxiety and anger was further exacerbated by the ongoing war effort, which demanded unity and conformity from all Americans while simultaneously highlighting the exclusion of minority communities from full participation in civic and economic life. Mexican-American youth, already targeted for their distinctive zoot suits and cultural expression, now found their clothing, language, and behavior interpreted as signs of moral deficiency and unpatriotic tendencies. The media coverage of the Sleepy Lagoon case often depicted zoot suiters as the architects of their own misfortune, suggesting that the murder was the inevitable outcome of their flamboyance, defiance, and association with a supposed criminal subculture. This narrative not only criminalized cultural identity but also legitimized the growing aggression directed at pachucos, effectively preparing the public psyche for the violence that would erupt in the streets of Los Angeles the following summer. The psychological toll on the Mexican-American community was profound. Parents, teachers, and community leaders faced the dual challenge of protecting their youth while combating the pervasive stereotype that their culture and identity were inherently dangerous. Young men, who had embraced the zoot suit as a badge of pride and self-expression, now felt the weight of systemic injustice pressing down upon them, a reality where every public appearance could be misinterpreted as defiance or threat. Neighborhoods, once safe havens of social interaction, became fraught with tension, and the presence of law enforcement, far from offering security, often intensified fear, as officers routinely treated the community as guilty until proven innocent. The Sleepy Lagoon trial, in this sense, was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a cultural crucible, a moment in which long-standing prejudices, economic disparities, and institutionalized racism converged, setting the stage for broader conflict. The consequences of the trial extended into the very fabric of daily life, influencing how Mexican-American youth navigated public spaces, social gatherings, and work environments. Zoot suiters were increasingly aware that their attire, once a statement of individuality and cultural pride, could now mark them for harassment or assault, both by civilians and by those tasked with enforcing the law. The message from the courts, amplified by media coverage and official commentary, was chillingly clear. Cultural identity could be construed as criminality, and society had the power to punish those who refused to conform. This dynamic not only heightened fear but also intensified resentment and the desire for self-assertion, creating a volatile mix of emotions that simmered beneath the city's surface. As summer approached in 1943, the climate of tension created by the Sleepy Lagoon trial reached a tipping point. The wrongful convictions, coupled with ongoing media vilification and law enforcement complicity, fanned the flames of fear and prejudice, leaving the city poised for conflict. The trial had transformed individual tragedy into a collective indictment, framing an entire community as culpable and justifying, in the minds of many white servicemen and civilians, aggressive and violent measures to restore order. In this way, the Sleepy Lagoon case was not simply a matter of legal injustice. It was a catalyst that crystallized decades of marginalization, prejudice, and cultural misunderstanding, making the outbreak of the Zoot Suit Riots an almost inevitable eruption of pent-up tensions. Social inequities, and the struggle for recognition in a city that had long sought to erase a proud community from its narrative. Through the lens of the Sleepy Lagoon trial, it becomes clear that the Zoot Suit Riots were not spontaneous, isolated incidents but rather the culmination of systemic injustice, public scapegoating, and cultural misunderstanding, revealing how legal proceedings, media influence, and societal prejudice can intersect to create a climate where violence becomes not only possible but, in the eyes of some, justified, and how the fight for dignity, identity, and recognition often begins in the shadow of injustice that seeks to define and suppress an entire community. By the early summer of 1943, Los Angeles had become a city teetering on the edge of eruption, a metropolis where the simmering tensions of racial prejudice, economic disparity, and cultural misunderstanding were poised to ignite into chaos. The stage was set by years of systemic discrimination, by media portrayals that demonized Mexican-American youth, and by a city whose law enforcement had repeatedly failed to protect its minority communities, instead perpetuating the very biases that stoked resentment and fear. In this combustible environment, the eruption came not in whispers or subtle acts, but in a wave of violence that would mark one of the darkest chapters in Los Angeles history. Conflagration remembered as the Zoot Suit Riots. The initial spark was almost incidental, a confrontation that might have seemed trivial if not for the charged atmosphere surrounding it. A group of white servicemen, emboldened by their numbers and the perceived authority of their uniforms, roamed the streets in search of Zoot Suiters, targeting Mexican-American youth whose style, pride, and cultural expression had been cast as threatening by the press and public officials. What began as a clash of words and gestures quickly escalated into physical violence. With fists, belts, and improvised weapons striking anyone identified as a pachuco, the attacks were not indiscriminate in their brutality. They were calculated, targeted, and symbolic. To strip a young man of his zoot suit was to strip him of identity, to assert dominance not merely over an individual but over an entire community, sending a message that difference would not be tolerated in a city that claimed equality but practiced exclusion. As the riots unfolded over the nights of early June, the streets of Los Angeles transformed into battlefields where terror reigned. Pachucos were dragged from restaurants, dance halls, and their own homes, thrown into alleyways, beaten, and forced to flee as mobs of uniformed men roamed neighborhoods, their anger amplified by alcohol, wartime stress, and the cultural prejudices they carried with them. The violence was deliberate, public, and performative. Crowds of white onlookers gathered not in shock but in complicity, cheering as zoot suits were torn, set aflame, and used to humiliate the young men who had dared to assert their presence in a city that sought to erase them. The attacks were not fleeting or sporadic. They were sustained, systematic, and carried out with the knowledge that law enforcement would offer little resistance. Officers, many of whom had long treated minority neighborhoods as occupied territory rather than communities under protection, either looked on indifferently or actively participated, framing the victims as instigators and reinforcing the narrative that the Mexican-American youth were guilty of defiance simply for existing visibly in their culture. The impact on the targeted communities was immediate and profound. Fear permeated homes, social spaces, and workplaces, as families witnessed their children, brothers, and neighbors being assaulted while those tasked with protection stood idle. The streets, once sites of vibrant social interaction and community cohesion, were transformed into zones of vulnerability, where the simple act of walking or gathering could invite violence. Yet even amidst this climate of fear, acts of resilience and defiance persisted. Pachucos and their allies sought to preserve dignity where the city sought to strip it away, using community networks to support the wounded, sharing warnings of danger, and quietly maintaining cultural practices that had become under attack. Asserting, in small but significant ways, that identity could not be erased by force. The scale and intensity of the riots also revealed the intersection of systemic injustice, cultural scapegoating, and wartime social pressures. The violence was not merely a reaction to clothing or youthful rebellion. It was the culmination of years of marginalization, economic displacement, and media-fueled fear. Newspapers had painted Zoot Suiters as criminal, unpatriotic, and inherently threatening, creating a climate where violence against them was tacitly approved and, in some circles, celebrated. The government's response, marked by inaction and later by punitive measures against those wearing Zoot suits rather than their attackers, only underscored the complicity of institutions in perpetuating injustice. The Zoot suit, once a symbol of self-expression and cultural pride, had become a visible marker of vulnerability, a target for a society eager to assert control over difference rather than engage with it. As the days progressed, the violence escalated, spreading across neighborhoods and drawing in increasing numbers of aggressors, many of whom had internalized the same prejudices and narratives that fueled the riots. Mexican-American youth faced assaults not only in East Los Angeles but also in surrounding districts, with stories of beatings, public humiliation, and property destruction multiplying in the newspapers, often framed as necessary responses to delinquency rather than acts of aggression. The sheer physicality of the riots, the dragging, beating, and stripping of young men was compounded by psychological terror, as the victims and their communities grappled with the knowledge that visibility and pride could provoke lethal consequences, and that the very institutions meant to protect them were either absent or actively hostile. Yet amidst the fear and violence, the events of the Zoot Suit Riots also laid bare the resilience of a community unwilling to be erased. Despite the trauma, Mexican-American families, cultural leaders, and youth found ways to assert agency, document their experiences, and begin the slow work of reclaiming narrative control over their identity. Murals, literature, and music later emerged as forms of resistance, preserving memory and embedding lessons about cultural pride, systemic bias, and collective resilience into the city's consciousness. The streets of Los Angeles, temporarily transformed into sites of terror, became, in historical retrospect, a crucible in which the struggle for justice, recognition, and equality was made starkly visible, illustrating the profound consequences of prejudice unchecked by law and the enduring power of cultural identity, even in the face of orchestrated violence. Through the lens of these harrowing nights, it becomes clear that the Zoot Suit Riots were more than episodic violence. They were a vivid manifestation of systemic racism, societal fear of difference, and the fragility of justice when institutions fail. The stripping of Zoot suits, the beatings, and the terrorizing of neighborhoods were acts designed to suppress identity and enforce conformity. Yet the stories of those who endured the riots reveal a counter-narrative of survival, cultural pride, and the unwavering human drive to assert one's place in a world that sought to deny it, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate in discussions of race, justice, and community resilience to this day. The Zoot Suit Riots of the 1940s, though marked by violence, injustice, and the systematic repression of Mexican-American youth, did not succeed in erasing the culture, identity, and resilience of the communities they sought to target. In the aftermath of the riots, as the smoke cleared and the bruises healed, powerful transformation began to take shape. What had been intended as an act of intimidation and social control instead ignited a renewed sense of pride and determination among Mexican-American youth and their families, laying the groundwork for a cultural and political awakening that would resonate for decades to come. From the streets of East Los Angeles to the halls of community centers, the survivors of the riots and their allies began to organize. The brutality they had endured, rather than silencing them, became a rallying point. Organizations such as the Community Service Organization so emerged, emphasizing civil rights, political representation, and grassroots activism. The stories of the pachucos, the young men who had been beaten, stripped, and publicly humiliated, were told and retold, forming the basis for a collective identity that refused to accept marginalization or injustice. These efforts helped transform a narrative of victimhood into one of empowerment, demonstrating that even in the face of systemic oppression, communities could reclaim their voice and assert their humanity. Art, literature, and music played a central role in this cultural renaissance. Murals began to appear across Los Angeles, depicting pachucos not as criminals, but as symbols of resistance, courage, and pride. Poets and writers captured the defiance, pain, and resilience of the Zoot Suit generation, ensuring that the memory of the riots would not fade into obscurity. Music, too, became a medium for cultural expression and resistance, with Chicano rock and jazz musicians incorporating elements of pachuco style and experience into their work. The Zoot Suit itself, once criminalized and ridiculed, evolved into a symbol of defiance, worn not only as clothing but as a statement of identity, refusal to be silenced or erased by systemic forces. The impact of the Zoot Suit Riots extended beyond cultural expression. It inspired political activism and civil rights movements that would shape the social landscape of Los Angeles and the United States. The struggles of the 1940s became a blueprint for later generations, as Chicano activists in the 1960s and 1970s drew direct inspiration from the resistance and solidarity forged in the wake of the riots. They demanded equal rights, an end to police brutality, fair access to education and employment, and representation in government and media. The energy and determination that grew from these early acts of defiance helped ensure that the lessons of 1943 were not forgotten, and that systemic oppression could be challenged through organized, sustained, and creative action. Beyond the Chicano community, the symbolism of the Zoot Suit resonated more broadly. Its exaggerated style, once criticized as unpatriotic or wasteful, became a global icon of rebellion against oppression. Influencing fashion, music, and youth culture in ways that transcended ethnic and national boundaries. From swing revival movements to hip-hop culture, the Zoot Suit has been embraced as a representation of individuality, pride, and resistance. A reminder that clothing and style can carry profound social meaning. Through this enduring symbol, the struggles and victories of the Zoot Suit generation continue to inspire new generations to stand against injustice, to celebrate their heritage, and to resist cultural erasure wherever it occurs. Most importantly, the Zoot Suit Riots offer lessons that remain deeply relevant today. They reveal the dangers of scapegoating communities, the power of media narratives to shape public perception, and the consequences of systemic indifference or complicity by those in positions of authority. They teach us that acts of cultural pride and self-expression should never be mistaken for threats to society, and that resilience, solidarity, and activism can turn moments of oppression into catalysts for long-term social change. By studying these events, reflecting on the courage of those who endured, and acknowledging the injustices they faced, we are reminded that history is not only a record of the past, but a guide for building a more equitable and inclusive future. As we remember the Zoot Suit Riots, we honor the courage, creativity, and unwavering spirit of the Mexican-American youth who refused to be erased, transforming their experiences of oppression into a legacy of activism and cultural pride. Their story continues to inspire artists, writers, musicians, and activists today, proving that identity, resistance, and dignity cannot be silenced by violence or prejudice. The Zoot Suit, once a target of hate, endures as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, communities can rise, reclaim their narrative, and leave a lasting impact on society. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a crucial chapter in Los Angeles history. If this story of resilience, identity, and the enduring fight for justice resonates with you, please give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring hidden truths and lessons from history. By learning from the past and sharing these stories, we keep the legacy of courage alive and ensure that the voices of those who came before us are never forgotten. Learn more about these powerful historical lessons and Chicano resilience by engaging with communities and archival projects that preserve this history.